Greek and Roman mythology. Myths of Crete and Attique. Chapter 5. Heracles. Heracles is a bewildering compound of god and hero. While he may properly be called the most heroic of the Grecian gods, he cannot with equal propriety be termed the most divine of the heroes. Indeed, so far is he from possessing that dignity which becomes a god, that some writers have argued his claim to divinity to be merely an inference from his exploits. But whether be god or hero, or both god and hero, Heracles represents the Greek idealization of mere bigness. Everything about him is big. His person, his weapon, his journeys, his enemies, his philanthropy, his sins, and his sense of humor. To explain him as a degenerate Zeus, as some do, may account for his origin, but it will not give the reason for more than his initial popularity. His hold on the people through many centuries was due to his colossal humanity. In him, men could see their ideal for every moment of the day and the consummation of every aspiration, whether good or bad. Now and again, Zeus or Apollo would stoop to the level of a weak humanity, but an apology, open or tacit, generally followed. For Heracles, on the contrary, no apology was forthcoming. Men took him as he was, and ignored his flouting of moral laws as a necessary accompaniment to the achievement of big things. He was big business personified, and the petty restrictions that hampered lesser beings was impertinent as regarding him. Thus, he represented a phase of Greek idealism which rebelled against the cold and soaring idealism of the thinkers, and embodied the frank confession of all classes of the Hellenic populace that the more spiritual elements of their advanced civilization were not as yet perfect instruments for securing and maintaining the welfare of human society. The story of Heracles' rejection of Aphrodite and his choice of Athene at the parting of the ways makes a very pretty apologue, but it does not reveal to us the Heracles whom the Greeks knew. Rather, he is here put on exhibition as a sort of reformed character by those who know and fear the effects of his moral example. At the earliest point to which he can be traced, Heracles seems to have been a hero of tyrants in Argolis, but his exploits were narrated in Rhodian sagas and carried by the ubiquitous Rhodian sailors to many parts of the Mediterranean. In various places, the sagas were modified and enlarged by foisting stories of purely local origin on Heracles, until, as his fame spread, some poet was inspired to assemble the many sagas under one title and to give to the world the first version of the labors. Heracles was apparently not at first the possession of all the Dorians, but became their hero par excellence through the influence of the Delphic oracle, perhaps not later than 700 BC. The birth of Heracles. When Perseus died, he left behind him in Mycenae 4 sons, Alcaios, Sthenelus, Mestor, and Electrine, the descendants of all of whom enter in some way or other into the story of Heracles. Alcaios had a son, Amphitryon, Electryon, a daughter, Alcmene, and besides lawful sons, a natural son, Lycmenos. Sthenelus, a son, Eurystheus, and Mestor, a daughter who bore to Poseidon a son, Taphios, the colonizer of the island of Taphos. During the reign of Electron in Mycenae, Tereus, a son of Typhos, became thither with his people and demanded a share of Mestor's kingdom. But, failing ignominiously in their errand, they attacked the son of Electron and slaughtered all except Lycmenos. When the battle was over, their fellow Taphians sailed away to Elis with Electron's cattle. Although not long afterward, Amphitryon redeemed them and brought them back to Mycenae. Electryon, bound on exacting vengeance for the outrage, assigned the affairs of state to Amphitryon and betrothed his daughter Alcmene to him on the condition that the marriage be deferred until the outcome of the expedition should be known. But after making these arrangements, and when about to take back his cattle, a missile from the hand of Amphitryon, probably wholly by accident, struck him and killed him. With the stain of family blood upon him, Amphitryon fled with his betrothed to Thebes, and allowed the power to fall into the hands of Sthenelus. But in their new home, Alcmene promised him she would ignore the strict letter of the terms of their betrothal, and would wed him, should he avenge the murderer of her brothers at the hands of the Taphian kingsmen. He met the promise by leading a well-equipped army of Thebans and their allies against Taphos. Although he was successful in his numerous raids, he was unable to secure a decisive victory as long as Teleros was alive. For this man, not unlike Nissos of Megara, had growing in his head a golden hair, on the continued possession of which hung the fate of himself and of his kingdom. Crazed with love for Amphitryon, Tereus' daughter plucked the hair from her father's head, and by that act surrendered her country to its enemies. But, filled with contempt for her treason, the victor killed her and took to Thebes the booty of Taphos. Now, in Amphitryon's absence, Alcmene had been visited by Zeus in the guise of her husband, and by him had become with child, so that when the real Amphitryon returned, he and his wife were confronted with a perplexing domestic riddle which was not satisfactorily solved till more than a year had passed. Just before Alcmene gave birth to her child, a scene was enacted on Olympus which had a profound influence on the child's career. The event is well described in the words of Agamemnon in the Iliad. Yea, even Zeus was blinded upon a time, he who, they say, is greatest among gods and men. Yet even Hera with female wile deceived. On the day when Alcmene in fair-crowned Thebes was to bring forth the strength of Heracles. For then proclaimed he solemnly among all the gods, Hear me, ye all, both gods and goddesses, while I utter the counsel of my soul within my heart. This day shall Eileithyia, the help of travailing women, bring to the light a man who shall be lord over all that dwelt round about, among the race of men who was sprung of me by blood. And to him in subtlety Queen Hera spake, Thou wilt play the cheat and not accomplish thy word. Come now, Olympian, swear me a firm oath that verily and indeed shall that man be lord over all that dwell round about, who this day shall fall between a woman's feet, even he among all men who are of the lineage of thy blood. So spake she, and Zeus no wise perceived her subtlety, but sware a mighty oath, and therewith was he so blinded. For Hera darted from Olympus's peak, and came swiftly to Achaean Argos, where she knew was the stately wife of Sthenelus the son of Perseus, who was also great with child, and her 7th month was come. Her son Hera brought to the light, though his tale of months was untold, but she strayed Alcmene's bearing, and kept the Eileithyia from her aid. Then she brought the tidings herself, and to Cronos' son Zeus she spake, Father Zeus of the bright lightning, a word will I speak to thee for thy heed. Today is born a man of valour, who shall rule among the Argives, Eurystheus, son of Sthenelus, the son of Perseus, of thy lineage. Not unmeet is it that he be lord among Argives. She said, but sharp pain smote him in the depths of his soul, and straightway he seized aid by her bright-haired head in the anger of his soul, and sware a mighty oath that never again to Olympus and the starry heaven should aid come, who blindeth all alike. He said, and whirling her in his hand flung her from the starry heaven, and quickly came she down among the works of men. Yet ever he groaned against her when he beheld his beloved son in cruel travail at Eurystheus' hest. When at length Alcmaeon's full time had come, she gave birth to Heracles and Iphiclus, the one the son of the deceiving Zeus, and the other born of Amphitryon. Childhood and youth of Heracles. When Heracles was only 8 months old, Hera sent 2 great serpents to his bed to destroy him. But a measure of the strength of mature years had come to him, and he rose and strangled them unaided. There is a version of this story to the effect that Amphitryon, in order to determine which of the 2 boys was really his son, put the serpents into the bed containing the children, the flight of Iphiclus proving him to be the offspring of a mortal. Under the instruction of a number of the famous heroes, Heracles was taught the accomplishments becoming a man: chariot driving, wrestling, archery, fighting in armor, and music. His teacher on the zither was Linos, the brother of Orpheus, but in this branch he was less apt than in the others, so that once, when Linos had occasion to punish him for his lack of diligence, Heracles hurled his zither at him and killed him. After trial for murder, he was acquitted through his clever quotation of a law of Rhadamanthus, but his father, fearing another outburst of violence, sent him to the glades as a herder, and there he grew in strength and stature and in skill, with the lance and the bow. His height was now 4 cubits, and his eye flashed fire like that of a true son of Zeus. Early manhood of Heracles. About the time when Heracles was on the verge of manhood, he determined to kill a lion which was ravaging his flocks and herds on the slope of Kithaeron. By using Thespiae as a base of operations, he at length achieved his task, and flaying the beast he took its skin as a cloak. As he was on his homeward journey, he met heralds of Aeginos, king of the Minyans, going to Thebes to get the annual tribute of the city. Heracles seized them, lopped off their ears and noses, bound their hands to their necks, and sent them back thus to their own land. Aeginos dispatched an army against Thebes, but in the battle which ensued he was killed by Heracles, and the Minyans had formed that day to pay to Thebes double the tribute which Thebes had formerly rendered to them. As a compensation for his efforts in arms, Heracles was given Megara, Creon's daughter, as his wife, who in the course of time bore him 3 children. The madness of Heracles. Heracles' successes heated the jealous wrath of Hera, and she visited a terrible madness upon the hero, who, not knowing what he did, killed his own children, and those of his brother Iphiclus, some with his bow, some by fire, and some with his sword. When he came to himself, overwhelmed with remorse, he left Thebes and went to Thespiae, where he was ceremonially purified of his sin. He departed thence for Delphi, where, in Apollo's shrine, the priestess uttered this prophecy: "From this day forth thy name shall no more be Alcides, but Heracles. In Tiryns thou shalt make thine abode, and there, serving Eurystheus, shalt thou accomplish thy labours. When this shall be, thou shalt become one of the immortals." With the words ringing in his ears, Heracles set out for Tiryns wearing a robe, the gift of Athene, and carrying the arms which the gods had given him: the sword of Hermes, the bow of Apollo, the bronze breastplate of Hephaestus, and a great club which he himself had cut in Nemea. The 12 Labours of Heracles. First Labour. The first labour which Eurystheus enjoined on Heracles was to kill the lion of Nemea, the seed of Typhon, and to bring its skin to Tiryns, although no man had been able as yet even to wound the beast. Going to Nemea, Heracles found its trail, which he followed until it led him to a cavern within 2 mouths, one of which he blocked up, and entering by the other, grappled with the lion and choked him to death. From Nemea to Mycenae he carried the body on his shoulders. Eurystheus stood aghast at the sight of the monstrous creature and at these proofs of Heracles' superhuman strength, and in his fear he prepared a storage jar in which to hide, forbidding Heracles ever to enter his gates again, and henceforth issuing his orders through heralds. As for Heracles, he turned this his first labour to good account, and from that day he wore the lion's skin, which no weapon could penetrate, at once as a cloak and a shield. Second labour. In the springs and swamps of Lernae dwelt a huge hydra, which used to lay waste the lands round about. And to ensure his death, Heracles was sent against this creature, from whose enormous body grew 9 heads, the middle one being immortal. The monster had defied all attempts to capture or to kill it, and had brought many strong men low. But finding the creature crouching sullenly in its lair, the hero forced it out by means of flaming missiles, and grasped it at the same instant that it seized him. Stoutly swinging his club, he knocked off the hydra's heads one by one, but to his alarm 2 heads grew in the place of each one that he destroyed, while a huge crab came to the aid of the hydra and gripped its assailant by the foot. This crab Heracles easily killed, and then, with the assistance of his nephew Iolaus, burned away the hydra's newly sprouting heads. At last he cut off the deathless head and placed it under a heavy stone, lest it rise to life again, and in the monster's gall he dipped all his arrowheads. The achievement of killing the hydra Eurystheus quibblingly disallowed on the ground that Heracles had not performed it alone. Third labour. Heracles was next ordered to proceed to a mountain range in the north of Peloponnesos and to carry away alive the Cairenian doe, which had golden horns and was sacred to Artemis. So swift of foot was it that it led the hero a weary chase for a whole year, but finally its strength flagged, and it fled across the mountain of Artemision to the banks of the river Ladon, where Heracles took it alive. Apollo and Artemis, however, disputed his rights to his prize, and Artemis even accused him of trying to kill her sacred animal. But by adroitly laying the blame on another, Heracles was at length allowed to bear the doe on his broad shoulders to Mycenae. Fourth labour. Still another beast of the wild was he commanded to capture alive, the fierce boar that came forth from the ridges of Erymanthos and wasted the town of Sophis. Heracles went to the mountain and was entertained by Pholus, a centaur, who, yielding to his guests' importunate request for wine to give zest to their repeat of meast, opened the jar taken from the centaur's common store. The other centaurs of the neighbourhood sniffed the aroma of the wine, and in a belligerent mood gathered about the dwelling of Pholus, whereupon Heracles attacked them, killing some and routing the others, so that they took refuge with the wise centaur, Charon. Unfortunately, an arrow shot at them chanced to hit Charon, inflicting a wound which Heracles would have healed, had not the pain of it driven the centaur to exchange his immortality for the mortality of Prometheus, and thus voluntarily to die. After this, by another unhappy accident, Pholus was killed by dropping one of Heracles' poisoned arrows on his foot. When the hero had buried his friend, he pursued the boar high up the slopes of the Erymanthos to the deep snow and snared it. And on his arrival at Mycenae with the huge creature, Eurystheus hid in the great jar. Fifth labor. Augeas, king of Elis, had so many herds of cows and goats that the offal from them had accumulated until all tillage was stopped. Eurystheus ordered Heracles to clean away the nuisance, and going to Augeas, the hero offered to perform the task on the stipulation that he should receive 1/10 of the flocks and herds, to which the king hesitatingly agreed. Without delay, Heracles broke down a large part of the foundations of the stables, and through the breach thus made diverted the united waters of the rivers Alpheus and Peneus, thus flushing the filth entirely away. Augeas, with the scrupulosity of an Eurystheus, now withheld the promised reward on the ground that Heracles was acting at the command of another and not of his own free will. But, he added, I will submit the question to arbitration. His sincerity was soon put to the test, for when his own son reproved him for his ingratitude, he turned both son and benefactor out of the country. This labor, too, Eurystheus refused to place to the credit of Heracles, for the technical reason that he had bargained for a reward. The story seems to be an old folk tale. Sixth labor. Heracles' next errand was to clear the marshes of Arcadian Stymphalos of the man-eating birds which used to congregate there, and which, owing to the dense growth of underbush and trees bordering on the marshes, were difficult of access. But Athene came to the help of Heracles and gave him some brazen cymbals by the clashing of which he compelled the birds to take to the air. And as they circled above his head, he shot them down one by one with his unerring arrows. It is probable that these birds typified a pestilence that arose from the areas of stagnant water. Seventh labor. With this labor, Heracles began his activities outside the Peloponnesos, being sent by his taskmaster to Crete to lead thence to the mainland the beautiful bull which Poseidon had caused to be borne from the sea for the sacrifice of Minos. Mastering the powerful creature, he rode it through the sea to Tiryns, and from there drove it overland to Mycenae, where it was loosed. But instead of remaining here, it roamed all over the land, mangling men and women as it went, until it was slain in Marathon by Theseus. Eighth labor. It was to the northern land of Thrace that Heracles was next dispatched, his task being to subdue and catch the man-eating horses of Diomedes, the son of Ares and the king of the Bistonians. By main strength he seized them and dragged them to the sea, but at this point the Bistonians harassed him to such a degree that he gave the steeds to his companion Abderos to guard. While he was engaged in routing the foe, the horses killed Abderos, who was buried by Heracles with the customary rites, and beside whose tomb the city of Abdera was founded by the hero. On receiving the horses, Eurystheus immediately loosed them as he had the bull, and they, rushing off to the highlands, were harried to death by the wild beasts. Ninth labor. Prior to this labor, the strength of Heracles had been pitted against beasts and men only, but now Eurystheus directed him to match it against the warrior women, the Amazons, who lived in a remote district of Asia Minor near the shores of the Euxine. Their chief interest was war, and only indirectly that of motherhood, and of all the children to whom they gave birth, they reared the females only, whose right breasts were cut off so as not to interfere with proper handling of the bow. Their queen was Hippolyte, a favorite of Ares, who had given her a beautiful girdle as a token of her prowess in arms, and to win this cincture was the errand of Heracles. Sailing from Greece with a group of companions, the hero touched at Paros and warred on the sons of Menos. Thence he proceeded to King Lycos of Mysia, whose territories he increased by the conquest of neighbouring tribes, and at last he reached the port of Themyscira, where Hippolyte visited him to learn the object of his mission. To his surprise, she promised to surrender her girdle without a struggle. But Hera, in the guise of an Amazon, stirred up the women against him, and Heracles, suspecting a plot in the ready promise, summarily slew their queen and sailed homeward with the prize. His route led him past Troy, and landing there, he found the city in the throes of a dreadful calamity. Years before, Apollo and Poseidon had jointly built the walls of the town for its king Laomedon, on condition of receiving a certain recompense. This, however, had never been given to them. Wherefore, in anger, Apollo afflicted Troy with the plague, and Poseidon sent a monster to devour the people as they went about the plain. Just before the hero's arrival, Laomedon, in order to spare his citizens, had bound his daughter Hesione to the sea rocks as a prey for the monster. And Heracles pledged himself to slay it and save Hesione, should the horses which Zeus had given Laomedon for the theft of Ganymedes be surrendered to him. He performed his part of the contract by leaping down into the monster's throat and cutting his way out through its belly. But the Trojans failed to fulfill theirs, whereupon, breathing out threats of a later punishment, Heracles embarked in his ship and sailed to Mycenae with his prize. Many scholars are now inclined to think that the original models of the Amazons were the Hittites, whose strange customs and apparel seemed to the Hellenes to be strikingly feminine. Tent Labour. Near the distant river of Okeanos was an island called Erythea, where lived Geryoneus, son of Chrysaor and the nymph Callirrhoe. He was a human monster with 3 bodies instead of 1, and he was known all over the world for his herd of red cattle, which were guarded by Eurytion and the 2-headed dog Orthos, a brother of the hellhound Kerberos. Heracles was assigned the task of driving this herd to Mycenae. Crossing Europe, he came to the straits between that continent and Africa, and set up 2 pillars as memorials of his journey. Here Helios beat so hotly upon his head that he shot an arrow at him, and in admiration for his attempt of the impossible, Helios gave him a golden cup, in which he crossed Okeanos and reached Erythea. With his club he easily put the warders of the herd out of the way, but it was only after a long struggle that he killed Geryoneus himself with an arrow. Gathering the cattle into the cup of Helios, he transported them to Europe and drove them eastward overland in successive stages. At Rhegium a bull broke loose, and swimming the straits to Sicily, mingled with the herds of King Eryx. And when Eryx resisted an attempt to regain the animal, Heracles wrestled with him and threw him to his death. From the toe of Italy to the extremity of the Adriatic the cattle were driven, and thence to the Hellespont. But many of them, maddened by a gadfly sent by Hera, wandered away from the main herd and were lost in the wild lands of Thrace. When Heracles arrived at Mycenae, he sacrificed the rest of the herd to Hera. 11th Labour. The 10 labours had consumed 8 years and 1 month, but the end was not yet, for owing to the quibbling of Eurystheus, the 10 counted as only 8. To complete the prescribed number, Eurystheus enjoined 2 more, in the first of which Heracles was required to bring back the golden apples of the Hesperides, or daughters of the evening land. These apples were very precious, having once been the wedding gift of Zeus to Hera, and to obtain them was perhaps the most difficult of all the labours of Heracles, for they were guarded not only by the Hesperides, but also by a deathless dragon of 100 heads, besides all which the hero did not yet know in just what part of the world they were to be found. Setting out at random in the hope of chancing upon his goal, Heracles came to the river Ecodaurus, where, in a contest of strength, he would have slain Eris's son Cycnos and had Zeus not separated them by a thunderbolt. Happening to find Nereus, the ancient of the sea, asleep on the banks of the Eridanus, the great river of the north, he seized him, and, in spite of his power to change into many forms, did not release him until he told where the golden apples were to be found. On learning this, he turned south to Libya, in which ruled Poseidon's son Antaios, who used to compel all strangers passing that way to wrestle with him. They were invariably killed in the struggle, but in Heracles he met more than his equal, for the hero lifted him aloft as though he had been nothing, and dashed him to pieces on the ground. From Libya Heracles passed on to Egypt, the kingdom of Bosiris, another son of Poseidon, who too was unkind to strangers, making a practice of sacrificing them to Zeus, alleging that he was thus obeying an oracle. His attendants bound Heracles to the altar, but with a single effort the hero burst the bounds and stained the shrine with the king's own blood. From Egypt he went on through Asia to the island of Rhodes, where he is said to have stolen a team of oxen and to have sacrificed them, notwithstanding the imprecations of their owner. From that time onward it was customary to utter imprecations when sacrificing to Heracles. Wandering across Arabia and Lydia, he chanced to come to the place where the unhappy Prometheus was changed. Moved with pity, he shot the bird that was tormenting him, unbound his fetters, and with the permission of Zeus gave him Charon's eternal immunity from death. At last he reached the end of his weary journey, the land of the Hyperboreans, where Atlas stood bearing the heavens on his shoulders. With little more ado, Heracles killed the dragon, plucked the apples, and conveyed them to Eurystheus. But as they were too divine for mortal keeping, they were later restored to the Hesperides. Another version of this legend, in which Atlas is beguiled to accomplish the theft, is inconsistent with the character of the traditional Heracles. 12th Labour. One realm of nature was as yet unconquered by Heracles, the underworld, and thither he was sent on his last mission to fetch Kerberos, the hellhound with 3 heads and the tail of a serpent, and out of whose body grew a writhing tangle of snakes. On his way to Tainaron in Laconia, the most spacious entry to the lower world, Heracles halted at Eleusis, and, as soon as Eumolpus had purified him of the blood of the centaurs, he was initiated into the mysteries. Once at the cave of Tainaron, he descended and found among the shades those of many whom he had known in the world above. Though the place was entirely strange to him, he could not be daunted from continuing his deeds of chivalry. He released Theseus from the bonds which Hades had thrown upon him, overpowered Menoetes, the herdsman of Hades's kine, until Persephone had to beg for him to be spared, and, killing one of the cattle, he shed its blood to gratify the gibbering shades. Kerberos he found on guard at the entrance to Acheron. Protected by his breastplate and impenetrable lion skin, he cautiously approached the beast, and, suddenly grasping him by the head and neck, forced him to submit to being led away. He made his ascent by way of the grotto at Troezen, and when he had shown the dog to Eurystheus as indisputable proof of his success, he took him back to Hades. The later adventures of Heracles. In Euboea. On his release from his servitude to Eurystheus, Heracles returned to his home city of Thebes, where his first act was to get rid of his wife without proper cause by heartlessly handing her over to Iolaus like a mere chattel. In casting about him for another spouse, he learned that Eurytos, lord of the Euboean city of Oechalia, had offered his daughter Iole to the man who should excel himself and his sons in archery. Heracles took up this very general challenge and won, but his fair prize was withheld from him on the ground that his madness might return and drive him to repeat the murderous deeds of his earlier years. Not long after this episode, the wily Autolycos stole some of Eurytos' cattle, but their owner attributed the theft to Heracles as an act of revenge. It chanced that Iphitos, one of Eurytos' sons, when searching for the lost animals, fell in with Heracles, whom he engaged to join him in his errand. But suddenly, in the midst of their peaceful intercourse at Tiryns, a fit of madness came over Heracles, and grasping his friend in his powerful arms, he dashed him to destruction from the summit of the city walls. Now in the eyes of the Greeks, an act of violence against a friend was one of the most reprehensible of sins, so that a dreadful disease which came upon Heracles was regarded by all as a just retribution for his evil doing. He sought purification at the hand of Nereus, or Neleus, but was ignominiously turned away as an offender for whom there was no pardon. Later, at Amyclae, he received it from the more tender-hearted Deiphobos, but this removed only his pollution, and in order to find a cure for his disease, he went to Delphi, where the priestess refused to dispense to him the healing wisdom of the oracle. Overmastered by rage, Heracles proceeded to sack the shrine, scattering its furnishings about as would an angry child, and, laying hold of the sacred tripod, he was on the point of setting up his own independent oracle when Apollo resisted him with force. In the midst of their struggle, they were unexpectedly separated by a thunderbolt of Zeus, whereupon the oracle revealed to Heracles that he would obtain relief from his malady and would make proper amends for his crime only when he had been sold into slavery and had served 3 years in bondage. In Lydia. Hermes sold Heracles to Omphale, the widow of Timolos, a former king of Lydia, and Eurytos, to whom the money realized from the sale was offered, refused it with a much more genuine scrupulousness than that which marks the actions of most characters of myth. This period in Heracles' life was relieved by many episodes which had a mirthful as well as a serious side. During a part of his servitude, Omphale, possessed of a saving sense of humor, made this most masculine of all the heroes wear woman's garb and engage in the narrow round of domestic duties, while she herself went about wearing the lion's skin and wielding the huge club. Yet Heracles was given enough freedom to allow him to go from land to land, accomplishing great exploits. Near Ephesus there were 2 men, called Cercopes, who made a practice of whaling travellers. And one day, when Heracles waked from a nap by the roadside, he saw them standing over him, wearing his armor and brandishing his weapons. Relying on his strength alone, he seized them, tied their feet together, and hanging them head downward, one on each end of a great stick of timber, he proceeded to carry them off. But soon, won over by their irrepressible pleasantries, let them go. In Aulis lived a certain Silius, who used to force passers-by to till his vineyards. But Heracles was not to be thus treated. Uprooting all the vines in the vineyard and piling them into a heap, he placed Silius and his daughter on the top and kindled it. although in one form of the tale he gorged himself at Silas's larder and then washed away the entire plantation by diverting the waters of the rivers across it. During his slavery he was of service to Lydia in crushing her enemies, and he also made a second expedition against the Amazons, and with the other heroes sailed on the Argo in the quest of the Golden Fleece. One of his many thoughtful acts was to bury the body of the bold but unfortunate Icarus, which he found cast by the waves on the seashore, and in gratitude Daedalus erected a statue of him at Olympia. At Troy. On attaining his liberty, Heracles promptly carried out his threat against Troy for her perfidy. Accompanied by many of the nobles from all parts of Greece, he went against the city with a fleet and an army, and having effected a landing and repulsed an attack of the Trojans, he drove them back and besieged them. Through a breach made in the walls, the Greeks finally entered the city, but at the expense of an altercation between Heracles and Telamon, one of his generals, who Heracles pettily urged had inconsiderately deprived his leader of the honor of being the first to set foot in the conquered city. Their quarrel was patched up, however, and Telamon was given the princess Hesione as a prize of war. Heracles slew the ungrateful Laomedon, but granted life to his son Podarces, or Swift-foot, who was afterward to be called Priamos. As the victors were sailing away to the west, Hera caught Zeus napping and sent violent storms upon them. But the Olympian punished her for her deceit by suspending her from heaven. Touching at Kos, Heracles engaged in a battle with Eurypylos, king of the island, slew him, and when himself wounded, was mysteriously removed to safety by his divine father Zeus. On reaching home, he was summoned to support the cause of the gods against the rebellious Titans. In the Peloponnesos. As Heracles had repaid Laomedon for his failure to keep a pledge, so was he to have revenge on Augeas. Assembling a host of volunteers, he invaded Elis and met with a powerful resistance. Falling ill, he succeeded in making a truce with the enemy, but they, on learning the reason of it and thinking to take him off his guard, attacked him treacherously. Heracles, however, was a master of retaliation, for when he subsequently caught them in an ambuscade, he put Augeas and his son to death, captured the city of Elis, and gave the kingdom to another. Then the valiant son of Zeus assembled in Pisa all his hosts and all the spoils of war, and measured off the boundaries of a precinct which he made sacred to his mighty sire. In the midst of the plain did he set aside a level space, the Altis, and fenced it round about. The land without the space did he ordain to be a place for feasting and for rest. Then to Alpheus's stream he sacrificed, and to the 12 sovereign gods. In the space which he had consecrated, Heracles celebrated the first Olympian Games. From Pisa he went against the city of Pylos, which fell before his arms, and here he encountered Periclymenos, one of the sons of Nereus, who tried to escape his fate by resorting to the powers of transformation which Poseidon had given him. He could change himself into a lion, a snake, a bee, or even so small an insect as a gnat. But when he had taken the form of this last and was about to escape, Heracles' vision was miraculously cleared, so that he detected and caught him, and slew him along with all the rest of his family, except his brother Nestor. In this struggle, Hades fought on the side of the Pylians and was grievously wounded by Heracles. Among the allies of Nereus had been the sons of Hippocon of Sparta, against whom Heracles organized an expedition for their opposition to him, and for their wanton murder of one of his kinsmen, as well as for a grudge against the Spartans who had withheld cleansing from him after the death of Iphitos. After much persuasion, he enlisted on his side King Cepheus of Tegea, and to save Tegea from capture during the absence of its defenders, he left with Cepheus's daughter a lock of Gorgon's hair enclosed in a bronze water jar. In the war that ensued, Iphiclus and the men of Tegea were killed, but in spite of this loss, Heracles was able in the end to overcome his foes and gain their city, which he restored to its rightful king, Tyndareus, or perhaps to his sons, who had been driven out by the sons of Hippocoon. It was just after this occasion that Heracles met Og in Tegea. In Aetolia and the mountains. Heracles crossed the Gulf of Corinth to Aetolia and became a suitor for the hand of Dinaria, the daughter of Oeneus of Calydon, although in so doing he became a rival of the powerful river god Achilles. While wrestling with the divinity, who had taken the form of a bull, the hero broke and retained one of his horns, which was so precious to its owner that for its restoration he allowed Heracles to possess Dinaria, and, besides, to take the wonderful horn of plenty, which would give him who held it as much food or drink as he should wish for. For many days Heracles was entertained by Oeneus, and even helped him in a war of conquest along the coast of the Adriatic. But, as usual, his bulk and strength got him into trouble in spite of himself. One day he chanced to kill a lad who was related to the king, and though forgiven by the lad's father, he went into voluntary exile, as the custom of the country required, and set out with Dinaria to take up his abode with Cakes of Trachis, a city on the other side of the mountains. Arriving at the river Evenos, over which Nessos the centaur used to ferry on his back those who travelled afoot, Heracles crossed alone, leaving his wife in the care of Nessos. As soon as the husband was a little distance away, the centaur made a vicious attack upon the woman. But at her outcry, Heracles turned, and with a well-aimed shaft pierced her assailant through the heart. When Nessos had crawled out on the river's bank to die, he called Dinaria to his side and gave her a mixture of his blood, which, he promised, would serve as a love philter to revive her husband's affection for her, should it wane at any time. As Heracles passed through the country of the Dryopians, he found himself in need of food. He had apparently forgotten the boundless capacity of his magic horn of plenty, so that, when none would give him food, he seized an ox and prepared a meal from it. The inhospitality of the Dryopians he never forgot, and later he punished them with a devastating war, killing their king as he was impiously feasting in a shrine of Apollo. Not long afterward, he went to the help of Aegemos, king of the Dorians, who was being beleaguered by the Lapithae, and drove the besiegers away. In this district there was a place well adapted for an ambuscade, which the votaries of Apollo had to pass on their southward journey to Delphi, and there Cycnos, a son of Ares, used to lie in wait and attack them as they went by. But when he met with Heracles, he was overpowered and slain, and thenceforth the pilgrims were unmolested. At last the moment arrived for Heracles to punish the faithlessness of Eurytus. Going against Oechalia, he slew the king and his sons and many of their allies, and then sacked the city and took Iole captive. When the news of this seizure reached the ears of Dinaria, her heart was aflame with jealousy, and she prepared to make use of the gift of Nessos. It happened that Heracles sent a messenger to her from Oechalia to bring back to him a ceremonial vestment for a solemn sacrifice. Choosing a robe, she poured over it some of the magic liquid, but her trust in Nessos turned out to have been too hasty, for it was no philter that he had given her, but a fiery liquid which wrapped the body of Heracles in deadly flames as soon as it donned the garment. Recognizing that his end was near, the hero ascended Mount Oita above Trachis and had a great pyre of wood built. Upon this he lay down and ordered those about him to kindle it. But none had the boldness of heart to take their master's life. At length a passer-by, Poias, or perhaps Poias's son, Philoctetes, was induced to do the deed by the gift of Heracles' bow and arrows. As the flames rose and consumed the hero, a cloud from which thunder proceeded was seen to gather over him and to take him into its bosom. And in heaven he was given the boon of immortality and wedded Hebe, the daughter of Hera. With Hera herself he was at last reconciled, while Deianira, when she contemplated the result of her awful deed, hanged herself. The descendants of Heracles. The sons of Heracles, the issue of his many amours at home and abroad, were in number as the sands of the sea. Of them all, Heracles' favourite was Hylos, a son of Deianira, and to him the hero gave the kingship of the Dorians, thus establishing the traditional bond between his line and the Dorian stock. On his father's death, Hylos married Iole. The children of Heracles, now fearing Eurystheus, fled to Trachis, and thence, still menaced, to various parts of Hellas. In the course of their wanderings, they came to Athens, begging for protection, and the Athenians, by giving them an army, did better for them than the fugitives had dared to hope, for the united forces routed the foe, and Hylos, pursuing Eurystheus as far as the Scironian rocks, slew him. The Heraclids then overran the Peloponnesos, but on the advent of a plague, they obeyed the injunction of an oracle and withdrew to Marathon, where they established a colony. Some time later, Hylos again sought the advice of an oracle and received the response that he and his brothers would come into their own at the end of the third harvest. Interpreting this literally, as was natural, they made several unsuccessful attempts against the Peloponnesos, in an early one of which Hylos lost his life in a duel with Echemos of Tegea. Finally, the god made known to the remaining brothers that the 3 harvests referred to 3 human generations, and thus, patiently awaiting the end of this period, they achieved their desire and divided the Peloponnesos into 3 parts: Argos, Lacedaemon, and Messene, each part being assigned to a branch of the family. Chapter 6. Theseus. In the story of his life as it now stands, Theseus is frankly an imitation of Heracles, although this does not mean that his figure owes its entire existence to its model. Apparently, legends of a certain Theseus were very clearly brought from Crete to the coasts of the Argolid about Troezen, and through long years of repetition, they became so familiar to the people as to be regarded as of local origin, and thus as fit themes for local poets. By means of poetry and cult, the name of Theseus was spread throughout Greece. But in Athens it wants especial recognition because of friendly relations between Athens and Troezen and her neighbor cities, thus supplying a foundation for the conscious manufacture of new myths and the compounding of old ones. When the Athenians reached the stage of possessing a political consciousness, they found themselves very different from their older neighbors in that they were without an organized body of myth extolling their descent and detailing the glorious exploits of a great hero forefather. Just like upstart wealth in a modern democracy concocting its aristocratic coat of arms, the Athenians resolved to set up a national hero and to drape his figure in the narrative of his alleged exploits. Theseus was ready at hand, partly Athenian, partly outsider. As an Athenian, he could easily win local affection. As an outsider, he was in a position to square with the people's political aspirations by breaking with the aristocracy and introducing a new order of things. The Athenians, therefore, took him as he was, and, for the sake of fixing him still more definitely in their locality, added a number of stories of long-established local currency to the stock of tales already gathered about him. So keenly aware were they of the calculated deliberation of the process that to them Theseus, of all the heroes, was in a class by himself, a personage almost across the threshold of history. Birth and childhood. King Aegeus of Athens, though twice married, was not blessed with children, and in his disappointment he sought the counsel of the oracle, receiving a riddling answer which only served to perplex him the more. Going to Troezen, he made known his trouble and the answer of the oracle to King Pythias, who quickly perceived the drift of the response, and just as quickly devised a scheme by which to fulfill it. Plying Aegeus with wine until his wits deserted him, Pythias left him overnight in the company of his daughter Aethra, and when morning dawned and Aegeus came to himself, he bade Aethra to rear the son she was destined to bear, and not to disclose his paternity to him until the proper time should come, which would be, he said, when their boy should be able to roll away a certain stone under which Aegeus had hidden a set of armour and weapons, and a pair of sandals. In due time the child was born, and was immediately, as most agree, given the name of Theseus. His grandfather Pythias diligently circulated the story that he was the son of Poseidon, the tutelary deity of Troezen, but his mother held her peace. Even as a mere child, Theseus showed himself fearless, for once, when Heracles, his kinsman, visited Troezen, he gazed without flinching at the dreadful lion skin. At 16 years of age he was fully grown, and as was the custom of young men, went to Delphi and presented to the god a clipped lock of his hair as a token of surrender of his life to the divine will. Then his mother took him to the stone, and when he had lifted it and donned the armour, revealed to him the mystery of his birth, and sent him to his father in Athens. The young man, confident in his strength and impelled by the desire to rival Heracles, decided to take the long and dangerous land route instead of the short and easy voyage across the gulf. Nothing could dissuade him from his purpose, not even the stories which Pythias told him of the cruel robbers infesting the highway. Indeed, these only whetted his appetite for adventure. With the intention merely of defending himself should need arise, and of wantonly harming none, he set out from Troezen on a journey that was fated to involve him in 6 great labours. The labours of Theseus. First labour. As Theseus passed through Epidaurus going northward, he was confronted by the robber Periphetes, a son of Hephaestus and Anticleia, who, inheriting his father's lameness, used an enormous club as an aid in walking. Standing across Theseus's path, he forbade him to proceed, but the hero, too quick and strong for him, pounced on him, killed him, and took his club both as a memento of the exploit and as an invincible weapon for the future. Second labor. At the Isthmus of Corinth lived Sinis, a giant son of Poseidon, who made a practice of seizing travelers on the Isthmian highway and of binding them to one or more resilient saplings that had been bent to the ground, the release of the trees allowing them to spring back to an upright position, and in so doing to tear asunder the bodies of the victims. This heartless wretch Theseus hoisted with his own petard, even forcing him to lend a hand in bending down the tree to which he was to be tied. On the death of Sinis, his daughter fled to a bed of tall asparagus and implored the plants to hide her. But when reassured by Theseus that no harm would befall her, she came out of a hiding place and consorted with him, afterward bearing a son, Melanippus, whose descendants worshipped the asparagus plant. This story may be a mythical version of a ritual of a Poseidon cult in the Isthmian groves. Third labor. To the right of the road, just as one left the isthmus, was the town of Cromenon. About this place roamed an unusually ferocious wild sow, to which the terrified neighborhood had given the name of Fire. Though personally unprovoked by the beast, Theseus turned aside from his path, and, to show his valor and fearlessness, attacked and slew her single-handed. Some of the ancient writers, rationalizing this myth, suggested that Fire was really a licentious murderess who was called a sow from her evil habits. This and the preceding theme seem to be of Isthmian origin. Fourth labor. A little distance to the west of the city of Megara was some lofty limestone cliffs, on the edge of which ran the road from the isthmus. Here was the station of the robber Scyron, who would compel passers-by to stop and wash his feet, and, as they stooped before him, would kick them over the precipice at the foot of which a huge turtle devoured their mangled bodies. Turning the tables, Theseus threw him over. Some of the Megarians, in an endeavor to avoid speaking evil of a fellow countryman, claimed that, in reality, Scyron was a suppressor of brigandage on this important highway. Be that as it may, it now seems probable that the story arose from a misunderstanding of a primitive ritual in which a human victim was thrown over the cliffs to remove pollution from the land and thus to ensure good crops. Fifth labor. At Eleusis, Theseus engaged Cercyon of Arcadia in a wrestling bout and killed him with a violent throw. Sixth labor. The road between Eleusis and Athens was beset by a cruel brigand known as Damastes, or subduer, or Procrustes, or stretcher, who took travelers captive and fitted them perforce to his bed. If they were too tall, he would mercilessly lop off their extremities, and, if too short, he would stretch them to his own length, invariably killing them by either process. But at Theseus's hands he met death by the treatment which he gave to others. Probably in Damastes we are to see the god of death, and in the bed of the democratic 7 feet of sword to which we must all come sooner or later. Theseus in Athens. Theseus had now reached the borders of Athens, but he did not cross them until he had been purified of the blood of Sinis, who was a kinsman of his own through their joint relationship with Poseidon. As he went across the city clad in a long flowing robe, he passed a temple on the roof of which the builders were still at work. These, noticing his peculiar garb, began to make sport of him, and asked him why a proper young lady like himself was out walking unescorted. Whereupon, without a word, Theseus unyoked a team of oxen standing by and tossed them higher than the peak of the building. The household of Aegeus he found to be in a desperate state, for the king had become old, and the people had grown restless under his feeble sceptre. But as there was no heir, he still clung tenaciously to the throne. Medea, who was now his wife, with the vision of a witch, recognized Theseus as soon as he appeared. But she kept her discovery to herself, and plotted to take his life by poisoning him at a feast. Theseus, however, detected her design, and at a timely moment revealed himself to his father by drawing his sword as if to cut the meat on the table. Aegeus and the populace received him with great joy and acknowledged him as the prince of the realm. But the cousins of Theseus, the sons of Pallas, were very angry, for his arrival had spoiled their chances of succeeding jointly to the throne. Declaring that Aegeus was only an adopted brother of Pallas, and that Theseus was an unknown outlander, they proclaimed war against him and plotted to entrap him. But a traitor revealed their plans, and Theseus retained the supremacy. Theseus in Crete. It was not long before Theseus had the opportunity of doing his greatest deed for Athens, for the time arrived when the Athenians must make their third payment of tribute of Attic youths to Minos, and the populace began to find fault with Aegeus on the ground that he had taken no steps to rid them of this periodic calamity. To still their chiding, Theseus offered himself as one of the victims of the Minotaur, while all the others were chosen by lot. Although one account of the legend states that Minos selected them all, naming Theseus first. Before going on board the ship, Theseus secretly assured his father that he would succeed in killing the Minotaur and thus free his people from their bondage. And since the tribute boat ordinarily carried a black sail to betoken the hopelessness of its passengers, Aegeus gave the helmsman a white one to be hoisted far out at sea on the voyage home if Theseus were returning safe and sound. It was probably after the arrival of the Attic youths in Crete that Minos expressed his doubts that Poseidon was the father of Theseus, and to make a test of his parentage, he threw a ring into the sea. Theseus plunged in after it, and was borne by a dolphin or a triton to the thrones of Poseidon and Amphitrite. There Poseidon granted him the fulfillment of 3 wishes that he might make in the future, while Amphitrite gave him a garland, and then, bearing the latter as an emblem of his divine birth, he emerged from the water, bringing the ring to Minos. Before the captives were enclosed in the labyrinth, Ariadne, a daughter of Minos, fell in love with Theseus, and promised to help him find his way out of the prison if he would bind himself to take her to Athens and make her his wife. Theseus promptly gave this easy pledge, and at the suggestion of Daedalus, Ariadne then presented him with a skein of linen thread, which he was to unwind as he advanced to the innermost recess of the labyrinth. Once there, he easily slew the Minotaur with his fists, and by following the thread, made his way back to the light. Embarking on his ship with Ariadne, he fled from Crete and touched at the island of Naxos. But as to just what happened here, the sources are not agreed. One has it that Theseus, tiring of his bride, deserted her, and that she in despair hanged herself. Another, that Dionysos, enamored of her, conveyed her to Lemos and forced her to wed him. And still another, that driven by a storm on the shores of Cyprus, Ariadne died from exposure, and Theseus instituted regular sacrifices at her tomb. At all events, Theseus reached home without her. But as the ship drew near to Athens, the helmsman in his great joy forgot to hoist the white sail, and Aegeus, seeing the black one, threw himself over the cliffs on which he stood and was dashed to pieces. On landing, Theseus buried his father's remains and paid his vows to Apollo. Theseus and the Bull of Marathon. The story of Theseus and the Bull of Marathon is really a continuation of that of his Cretan adventures. It will be remembered that the beast had killed Androgeus, the son of Minos, and after this it continued unchecked its ravages among both men and crops. Assigning himself the task of subduing it, Theseus went to Marathon, grappled with the bull, and by sheer strength of muscle forced it to submit to his will, after which he drove it across country and through the streets of Athens, at last sacrificing it on the altar of Apollo. Theseus as king and statesman. When, on the death of his father, Theseus became the head of the state, he soon perceived that the lack of proper political association among the scattered townships of Attique was a great source of weakness for his country, and, in order to secure cooperation among them in the works of peace and war alike, he persuaded the various communities to unite in the formation of a commonwealth. He then appointed central places for meeting and conference, instituted a national festival, drew applause, and issued a state currency. He divided the populace into three classes: nobles, farmers, and artisans, giving each class its special political function. He invited outsiders to settle in Athens and enjoy the rights of citizenship. He annexed Megara, and in emulation of Heracles, founded games on the isthmus in honor of Poseidon. In order to appear democratic, he proposed to the people that he be known not as king, but as commander-in-chief of the army and defender of the laws. Yet, despite all this, he was always regarded as king. The later adventures of Theseus. The Amazons. Like Heracles, Theseus had what we may call his supernumerary adventures, the first of which is generally accounted to have been his expedition against the Amazons. Whether this was purely his own venture, or whether he was merely the comrade of Heracles, is by no means clearly determined, but in either instance he won Antiope as the prize of his efforts and took her back to Athens. For her seizure, the Amazons declared war against Athens and besieged the Acropolis, encamping on an eminence at its foot. And since they were the daughters of Ares, this height was from that time known as Areopagos. For another legendary explanation of the name, see above, page 70. The siege lasted 4 months and was broken only through the intercession of Theseus's Amazon wife, although some authorities, on the contrary, assert that she fought against her own race and died at her husband's side, pierced by a javelin. Many of the slain Amazons were buried in the vicinity of Athens, and their graves were objects of interest to travelers for many centuries. This mythical conflict foreshadowed the later wars of history, in which Athens was to be the leader of the Greeks against invading barbarians. Theseus and Hippolytus. If we are to discredit the story of Antiope's noble death, we must accept another in which she was set aside by the fickle Theseus in favor of Phaedra, a sister of the deserted Ariadne. According to this version, her rejection gave her a pretext for leading the Amazons to prosecute a war against Athens. But by Theseus she left a son, Hippolytus. He turned out to be a somewhat intractable compound of a Jehu and a Joseph. As a youth, he was devoted to the hunt and was a diligent worshipper of the chaste Artemis, while Aphrodite and all her works he hated with a holy hatred. For this, Aphrodite punished him, causing his stepmother Phaedra to burn with love for him and to make evil advances. But when he haughtily rejected these, she slandered him before his father, who banished him and besought Poseidon to visit destruction upon him as the fulfillment of one of the 3 wishes he was to grant. Poseidon heard the prayer and raised up from the sea an enormous bull, which so frightened the horses of Hippolytos that they ran away and killed him. When it was too late, the truth of the matter was revealed to the remorseful Theseus, while the guilty Phaedra took her own life by hanging. Friendship with Perithous. Perithous had heard of the great strength of Theseus, and, in order to test it, drove some of Theseus's cattle from the plain of Marathon. Theseus pursued the raider, but, when they came face to face, they found themselves unexpectedly attracted to one another. Perithous promptly offered to pay whatever damages Theseus might claim, but all that the latter would accept was a pledge of friendship, and thenceforth they were inseparable. Theseus was present at the wedding of Perithous to Didymia in the country of the Lapithae, when some Thessalian centaurs, who were also guests, became heated with wine and attacked the Lapith women. But, led by Theseus, the men fought them off, slew some, and drove others from the land. When Theseus was about 50 years old, the 2 friends kidnapped Helen of Sparta and held her for a while in Attic territory, this constituting an adventure with whose details we have already become acquainted. During her detention, Theseus accompanied Perithous to the home of Hades to seize Persephone and make her the bride of Perithous. But the task was not like that of capturing the partly mortal Helen, for Hades had the 2 abductors overpowered and bound with serpents to the seat of Lethe, or forgetfulness. Heracles later set Theseus free, but even his great strength was insufficient to enable him to lose Perithous. Death of Theseus. On returning to Athens, Theseus learned that Helen's brothers had stormed the fortress where she had been held captive and had taken her back to Sparta, and, along with her, his own mother Aithra, while, to increase his troubles, another political party was in the ascendancy and was instigating the people against him. Finding the opposition too great, he solemnly cursed the Athenians and with his family withdrew to the rocky island of Skyros, where, it is said, at the command of the king of the island, he was pushed over the sea cliffs and killed. After the fall of Troy, his children returned to Athens and reigned. Nevertheless, the spirit of Theseus was not dead, for at Marathon he fought on the side of the Athenians and turned the tide of battle in their favor. At the close of the Persian wars, his bones were brought to Athens from Skyros in obedience to an oracle, and buried with great pomp in a tomb in the heart of the city. Chapter 7. The Voyage of the Argo. The Voyage of the Argo is the great culminating episode in the vicissitudes of certain branches of the family of Iolaus, and it will, therefore, be necessary to review the lives of the most important personages of this family. The descendants of Iolaus: Salmoneus, Pelias. Salmoneus, a son of Iolaus, who had settled in Elis, drew upon himself the divine anger for having attempted to usurp some of the prerogatives of Zeus, for he made a practice of imitating the thunder and the lightning of a rainstorm, and was killed by a real bolt from the hand of Zeus. From this description of him, we are to infer that he was of the class of rain-making magicians still to be found in some primitive communities. His daughter Tyro was forced to yield to the embraces of Poseidon and bore twin sons, Nereus or Neleus and Peleus, who were exposed in infancy, but were found and reared in another family than their own. Nereus and his children were slain by Heracles at Pylos, but Peleus took up his abode somewhere in Thessaly, married, and had, among other children, a son, Acastus, and a daughter, Alcestis, who was destined to become one of the most famous of women. For an impious act of his youth, Hera visited on Peleus a curse which was to follow him through life. Tyro, after the abandonment of her children, was legally wedded to Cretheus, her father's brother, and became the mother of 3 more children, Amathion, Aeson, and Pheres, who lived together in the Thessalian city of Aeolcos, which Cretheus had founded, until Pheres, with laudable enterprise, built the new city of Pherae on an inland site not many leagues away, and became its king. In his old age, Pheres gave up the throne to his son Admetos. Admetos and Alcestis. The story of the courtship and wedded life of Admetos is the theme of the Alcestis of Euripides. The beginning of the story goes back to Apollo's slaying of the Cyclopes in revenge for the death of his son Asclepius. And for this murder he was punished by Zeus, being sent to serve as a slave to a mortal man. That man chanced to be Admetos, who treated the god with the kindest hospitality and was rewarded by a great increase in his flocks and herds. Seeking in marriage Alcestis, the daughter of his kinsman Peleus, he went to Aeolcos and paid her court. But her father had promised that he would give her only to the man who should succeed in yoking to a car a lion and a wild boar. When it seemed to Admetos as if this impossible condition would compel him to forego his love, Apollo yoked the animals and helped him win his bride. At the wedding sacrifice, however, Admetos forgot to give victims to Artemis, who, to requite him, filled his bridal chamber with serpents. But Apollo bade him offer suitable propitiation, and obtained for him from the fates the boon that, when about to pass away, he should be spared the actual terrors of dissolution through the death of a voluntary substitute. At last Admetos' fated day came, and all of his friends and kin, none but his dear wife Alcestis was willing to die for him. He became well again, while she sickened and died and was buried. But by chance Heracles passed through Pherae bound for Thrace, and learning the cause of the mourning in the house he entered the tomb, defeated death, and amid general rejoicing brought Alcestis back to her husband. Athamas, Phrixus, and Helle. Athamas, another son of Ilos, had 2 children, a son Phrixus and a daughter Helle, by an earlier marriage than that with Ino, who was very jealous of them and plotted to destroy them. Secretly advising the women of the country to roast the corn before sowing, she brought about a failure of the crops. And when Athamas sent messengers to the oracle to inquire how to remove this condition, Ino suborned them, and they brought back a false report, announcing that the land would again bear fruit if Phrixus were sacrificed to Zeus. As the lad stood by the altar to be slain, his mother Nephele suddenly led out a ram with a golden fleece, the offspring of Poseidon and Theophane, and placing Phrixus and Helle on the animal, she drove it away. Swiftly it went eastward overland to the straits between Europe and Asia. But as it was swimming, these helle fell off its back into the water and was drowned. Whence, ever afterward, the Greeks knew the straits as the Hellespont, or Hellas Sea. Phrixus, on the other hand, was borne by the ram to the farther end of the Euxine, where was the land of Colchis, over which King Aeetes ruled. There, as the story goes, manhood, and afterward returned to his home in the west. Although, according to a variant legend, he was killed by Aeetes, and the ram was sacrificed to Zeus, while its golden fleece was hung on a mighty oak in the grove of Eris and guarded by a dragon. The return of Iason. The narrative now returns to Iolcos. When Cretheus died, his son Aeson was dispossessed of his kingdom by his half-brother Peleus, but he still lived on in Iolcos and offered no resistance to the usurper. To prepare, however, for a day of vengeance, he craftily announced that his son Iason were dead, whereas, in reality, he had sent him away to Cheiron to be educated, while to Peleus he made the prophecy that someday he, Peleus, would die at the hands of an Iolid or by an incurable poison. Years after this, Iason returned to Iolcos, and with many others was invited to Peleus to a feast of Poseidon. But in crossing a swollen stream on the way, he chanced to lose his left sandal in the mire. As he approached with only his right foot shod, Peleus observed him, and when he learned who he was, called to mind with a great shock that this was the mark of the man by whom he was doomed to die. After a conference of several days with his father and other kinsfolk, Iason, appearing before Peleus, boldly asked him to surrender the throne and scepter, and the usurper weakly assented, but begged him to have pity on his old age. Would he not first of all, he asked, recover the golden fleece, and by thus appeasing the soul of Phrixus, bring peace to the line of Iolaus? On this condition, Peleus was willing to step down from the throne without a struggle. Iason accepted the task, but, suspecting a ruse against his life, engaged Acastus, Peleus' son, to share the dangers of the adventure with him. The voyage of the Argo. Summoning Argos, a son of Phrixus, Iason bade him build a 50-oared ship, and with the help of Athene, Argos fashioned the most excellent of all ships that have made trial of the sea with oars, and named it the Argo. Into its prow Athene fitted a piece of the talking oak of Zeus at Dodona, and when it was completed, Iason sent heralds throughout Greece, announcing his expedition. From all parts men hastened to enroll themselves as his companions. Their number was too great for us to catalogue them here, but we may say that all of them were real heroes, the crown of men, like gods in fight, many of whom we have met in the myths already recorded. Bidding farewell to the people of Iolcos, the company withdrew to the seashore, and beside the ship held a council, in which, with one accord, they elected Iason their leader. After a sacrifice to Apollo, in which they found the omens favourable, they launched the Argo and sailed away through the Gulf of Pagasai to the open Aegean, and their arms shone in the sun like flames as the ship sped on. Skirting the coast, they held first a northward and later an eastward course, until they came to Lemnos, where lived a race of women, ruled by Hippospyle, who, out of jealousy, had killed of all their husbands, but who, by this time, weary of single existence, joyfully welcomed the Argos' crew and tempted them to delay among them for a season. With the weakness of true sailors, the men yielded to their beguilements and lingered many days. And perhaps they would utterly have forgotten their goal had not Heracles vigorously brought them to their senses. Embarking once more, they sailed north to Samothrace, where they accepted initiation into the sacred mysteries in order to ensure themselves a safe return. And thence they passed through the Hellespont, dark gleaming with eddies, to the island of Cyzicus, the land of the Doliones. Here they obtained stores and information, and had to ward off an attack of the 6-armed, earth-born men, many of whom fell before the bow of Heracles. After proceeding only a short distance eastward, they were buffeted by headwinds and driven back to another part of the island. The same Doliones who had given them food saw them land, but were unable to recognize them owing to the distance. And taking them for pirates, they set upon them, only to bring destruction upon themselves. For 12 days and 12 nights the Argonauts were detained here by reason of storms, which abated, however, after a sacrifice to Hera. When they had rowed to a point on the coast of Mysia, Heracles and Hylas, his favorite youth, went ashore and made their way into the forest, the one to get wood and the other to draw water. But as Hylas stooped over a spring, the water nymphs, won by his beauty, reached up and drew him under. One who heard him cry out ran and told Heracles, thinking that a beast had slain him, and in vain the hero wandered back and forth through the forest searching for the lad, being away so long that his friends on the Argo forgot him and put to sea without him. Coming next to the country of the Bebrycians, the Argonauts were challenged by King Amycus to choose one of their number to contend with him in boxing, and Polydeuces, brother of Castor, offered himself. Fighting, each with his boxing gauntlets on, they smote one another with such blows as when shipwrights with their hammers smite ships' timbers, until at last Polydeuces placed a blow squarely on Amycus's head, and he fell to the ground with his skull crushed in. At that moment the Bebrycian people assailed the slayer of their king, but his companions repelled them and overran the land, taking much booty. On the following day they passed through the Bosphorus and touched at the home of the blind old seer Phineus, whom the gods had not only punished with blindness, but had doomed never to taste of food from his own board. Whenever viands were placed before him, the Harpies would pounce upon them and carry them off, leaving an overpowering stench. Phineus asked the Argonauts, Zetes and Calais, to fulfill a certain prophecy and free him from these pests. And accordingly, when the Harpies came to seize the next meal, the winged heroes fled aloft and pursued them so far out to the sea that Ares took pity on them and pledged that their depredations would cease. The Argos crew then spread a bountiful feast for Phineus to celebrate the breaking of his long fast, and heard from his lips a prophecy outlining their journey and foretelling their success as far as Colchis. The rest of their future he veiled in silence. Leaving the Bosphorus, they were safely guided by Athene through the dangerous Symplegades, two great moving rocks which cleave the waves more swiftly than the tempest. And coming to the open Euxine, they turned their prow to the east and pressed on to the island of Thynias, and thence to the mouth of the river Acheron, where several of them were killed. Though discouraged, they sailed to Sinope, past the mouth of the river Halys and the country of the Amazons, to the Chalybis, the nation of iron workers, and to the Mosynokoi, or the people of topsy-turvy morals, and halted at the Isle of Eris, where the sea-birds dropped sharp, feathered shafts upon them. Here they found 4 sons of Phrixus, who had been shipwrecked in sailing away from Colchis, and who endeavoured to dissuade Iason from pursuing his errand further, but to no purpose, for Iason all the more eagerly urged his companions on. At last they came to the river Phasis, on one bank of which stood the city and palace of Aeetes, while on the other was the grove sheltering the Golden Fleece. The gods now began to intrigue in favour of the Argonauts. Hera and Athene beguiled Aphrodite to instill a passion for Iason in the heart of Medea, one of the daughters of Aeetes. This was of supreme moment for the Argonaut leader, since without her assistance he would have been helpless before the task which Aeetes demanded that he accomplish as the price of the fleece, this requirement being to plough a field with a yoke of bulls with brazen feet and flaming breath, to sow it with dragon's teeth, and then to slay the armed men that should spring up from the strained seed. Now, since Medea was a sorceress and a priestess of Hecate, she compounded a drug which would render one anointed with it immune from fire and iron for 1 day, and secretly meeting Iason, she gave it to him. After telling one another of their love, they parted, and at dawn Iason, with his body and armour anointed with Medea's charm, faced the ferocious bulls. Throwing them with ease, he forced them to submit to the yoke and to plough the field. And when the warriors had sprung up from the dragon's teeth scattered broadcast, he hurled a stone into their midst, as Cadmos had done at Thebes, and set them to killing one another. He had now completed his task unharmed, and Aeetes was filled with dismay. As soon as Medea realized the full meaning of what she had done, she fled secretly to Iason and promised to help him win the Golden Fleece if he would pledge his word to take her with him to Hellas and make her his bride. Accepting this condition, Iason was led by her to the oak on which the fleece was hung, and while she cast a spell on the dragon, he snatched the prize and fled with her to the Argo. They were soon well out to the sea, hotly pursued by Aeetes. But when Medea saw her father drawing nearer, she resorted to a cruel device to check him. Killing her brother Apsyrtos, whom she had taken with her, she scattered his severed members over the water, thus forcing Aeetes, through his sense of piety, to collect them and to go ashore and give them proper burial. In the meantime, the Argo had outdistanced him and safely reached the delta of the Danube. And although a few Colchians came up a little later, they were beaten off. Somehow, in defiance of the geography of the region as it is known today, the Argonauts made their way by water to the head of the Adriatic Sea, and thence went southward to the island of Kerkyra, or Corfu. With human voice, the Argo now spoke to them solemn words of warning, declaring that for the murder of Apsyrtos, their homecoming would be delayed by Zeus until they should reach Ausonia and be purged of their sin by Circe. In search of this strange land, they sailed to the river Eridanos and to the Rhodanos, or Rhone, but, warned by Hera, avoided the Rhine. At length they found their goal, and, being purified, with joyful hearts turned their prow towards Hellas under the safe guidance of the Nereids. The Argonauts' route led them past Anthemoessa, the island of the Sirens, whose blandishments, however, did not overcome them, for the song of their companion Orpheus drowned the alluring voices. They fared past Scylla and Charybdis and the island of Thyracia, with its herds of the cattle of the sun, and came to the land of the Phaeacians. In this place they were met by a band of Colchians who demanded the restoration of Medea. But the Phaeacian king intervened as arbiter and said that she would be surrendered only on condition that she were yet unwedded to Iason. Whereupon the pair made haste to become man and wife and foiled the Colchians' plans. After a sojourn of many days among the hospitable Phaeacians, the men of the Argo resumed their journey. But when they were just in sight of the Peloponnesos, they were driven by a northerly gale across the sea to Libya, and were held by the shoals of the Syrtis. As Iason was wondering how to extricate his ship from these dangerous waters, he had a fortunate dream, being told in vision that he would see a horse emerge from the deep, and that the Argonauts, taking their vessel on their shoulders, were to follow the steed whithersoever it might lead. The prediction came true, and for 12 days and 12 nights they were guided overland by a horse to the Tritonian lake, near which they found the Hesperides, who informed them that Heracles had been there only the day before in quest of the golden apples. Desirous of seeing their former comrade, they searched the wild country round about, and with no more result than to discover that they were hopelessly lost in a strange land, until, in their despair, Triton appeared to them and showed them the way to the Sea of Minos. Reaching the sea, they sailed to Crete, but when they attempted to land, they were beaten off by the Cretan coast patrol, Talos. Now this man was one of the race of bronze, and from his neck to each of his ankles ran a great vein, the lower end of which was stopped by a bronze stud, which was his vulnerable spot. Putting Talos under a spell, Medea drew out a stud and let him bleed to death. After a delay in Crete of only 1 day, the heroes hastened past Aegina and Euboea, and soon entered their home port of Pagasai, from which they had set out 4 months before. The death of Pelias. The end of the voyage is not the end of the story. So far was the perfidious Pelias from yielding his kingdom, now that his conditions had been fulfilled, that he even plotted against Iason and his family. Iason and his wife were driven to take their own lives, and Iason, for safety's sake, withdrew to Corinth, where he dedicated the Argo to Poseidon, and from where he never ceased sending messages to Medea, encouraging her to devise some means of removing Pelias. According to another form of the story, Medea by her magic arts restored both Iason and his father to youth, thus arousing in the hearts of the daughters of Pelias so keen a desire that their father too should be rejuvenated that the sorceress professed to give them a recipe for this transformation, and a demonstration of its working. Cutting up the body of an old goat, she boiled the pieces with some herbs in a cauldron, and at the conclusion of a process, a kid emerged from the magic stew. Just as the wily Medea had calculated, the loving daughters of Pelias submitted their father to a similar process and brought about his death. For her part in this murder, Medea was exiled from Iolcos along with Iason. Iason and Medea in Corinth. The exiles took refuge in Corinth. For about 10 years they lived happily together. But at length the differences between the Greek and the barbarian temperaments became painfully apparent, and a domestic clash ensued, so that finally Iason set Medea and her 2 children aside, and took the Corinthian princess Glauce as his wife. Iason ought to have known his revengeful Medea too well to have followed such a course, for through her children she sent a poisoned robe and garland to Glauce, who, when she put them on, was burned to death. After her children had returned from their errand, Medea pierced them with a sword, and fled to Athens in a chariot drawn by winged dragons, which had been sent to her by her grandsire, Helios. Medea in Athens. In Athens, Medea became the wife of Aegeus and bore him a son Medos. But when she plotted to take the life of Theseus, she and her son were banished from the kingdom. Medos conquered the barbarians of the east and called the country Medea, while his mother returned in disguise to her native land, expelled her uncle Perses, who had usurped the throne, and restored her father Atys to his rights. Some students of myth interpret the incidents gathering about the life and death of Pelias as originating in a nature myth, but it seems much more in harmony with the known processes of the growth of myth to infer that the story is an epic development of an early historical incident, or of a group of related incidents. Pelias appears to have been the hero of an agricultural people of southern Thessaly, who were led with great reluctance to abandon agriculture as their chief means of subsistence and to take to seafaring instead. The adventures of the Argonauts are, therefore, wild exaggerations of the yarns of sailors, who in very early times penetrated the strange lands of the Mediterranean basin, interwoven with many genuine folk tales. Chapter 8. The Tale of Troy. The tale of Troy, like that of the Argonauts, is in its complete form a tissue of many stories woven at sundry times about a single great incident. Some of the legends deal with secular facts directly pertinent to the incident, the war for Troy and the command of the Dardanelles. Some are plainly folk tales of a variety of origins, dragged in, so to speak, as embellishments to an interesting theme. Some, not wholly to be differentiated from the preceding class, are myths drawn from certain cults and rituals, and others must be purely conscious inventions. The tale of Troy is not a drama, but rather a great treasury of dramas, and most of its personages, both human and divine, have been made known to us in scenes already portrayed. We must now marshal the human personages by families and sketch those parts of their histories which, in combination, led up to the Great War. The House of Dardanos. Dardanos, a son of Zeus, lived in the island of Samothrace with his brother Iasion, who was struck dead by a thunderbolt for a shameful crime, while Dardanos, in grief, left his home and established a new one on the Asiatic mainland near the mouth of the Hellespont. Finding favor with Teucros, the king of the land, he was given a tract in which he built a city called after himself, and later he inherited the sovereignty and changed the name of the entire country to Dardania. After him the throne was occupied successively by a son, Erichthonius, and by a grandson, Tros, who saw fit to call the country Troia. This Tros had 3 sons, Ganymedes, Assaracos, and Ilos. The first, while still a youth, was loved by Zeus for his beauty, and was carried away by an eagle to Olympus, where he became the cupbearer of the king of the gods. Assaracos is known chiefly through his descendants. A grandson, Anchises, became by Aphrodite the father of the great Aeneas. In a wrestling contest in Phrygia, Ilos won as a prize 50 youths and 50 maidens, and received from the king of the country a spotted heifer, which he was directed to follow until it should lie down. On that spot he was to establish a city. In accordance with these directions, he founded Ilion, and after praying for a sign of the approval of Zeus, he discovered standing before his tent the Palladion, an image of Pallas Athene of almost human size. Building a shrine, he placed a statue within it as a symbol of his city's life, and at his death the chief authority was left in the hands of his son Lemodon, whom Heracles afterwards killed for his failure to keep his word. With Ilos' son Podarches, later known as Priamos or Priam, begins the important part of the history of Ilion or Troy. Priam first wedded Arisbe, and afterwards Hecabe, in Latin Hecuba, the daughter of Chisias, or Dymas, or Sangarius. The first child that Hecabe gave him was the mighty Hector, but when she was about to bring another infant into the world, she dreamed that she had given birth to a flaming torch which fired and consumed Ilion, and this vision a reader of dreams interpreted to mean that the babe would destroy his native city. Priam, in fear of the sign, had him exposed immediately after birth on the slopes of Mount Ida. But, as the fates would have it, he was first nourished by a she-bear, and was then found by a herdsman, who reared him till he had attained the years of manhood. The name first given to him was Paris, but for his success in warding off robbers from the falls and for his beauty, it was changed to Alexandros, or defender of men. It happened that a favorite bullock of his herd was sent to Priam as a victim for a sacrifice, which the king was to offer for the very son whom he had exposed. But Paris followed the beast to Ilion, and in a series of contests overcame a number of his brothers. Just as Deiphobos, one of them, was about to thrust him through with a sword, Cassandra, his sister, with a divine vision, recognized him and led him to Priam, who gave him a place in his rightful home. Later on he married the prophetess Oinon. The house of Tantalos. Tantalos, who was the son of Zeus and the nymph Plauto, and lived on Mount Sipylos near the Lydian city of Sardes, was so wise that Zeus confided to him his secret thoughts and even admitted to him to the banquets of the gods. At one of these feasts he placed before the gods the severed members of his son Pelops, but only Demeter took a portion, whereas the others, observing that the flesh was human, united in restoring the boy to life. Instead of the shoulder which she had eaten, Demeter inserted a piece of ivory, which remained with him all his days, and became so much a natural part of him that each of his descendants inherited an ivory shoulder. For his sin against the gods, Tantalos received special punishments in the underworld. The restored Pelops was endowed with such beauty that Poseidon gave him a chariot which would fly over land and sea, and confident in his charms, he presented himself as a suitor of Hippodamia, the daughter of Oinomaus, the king of Pisa in Elis. The maiden reciprocated his love, but he was unable to wed her because of the strange conditions imposed by her father, who had been told by an oracle that he would be murdered by the man who should wed his daughter. Resolved to defeat the oracle by having no son-in-law, he challenged each of his daughter's suitors to a chariot race, stipulating that if the suitor won, he was to receive Hippodamia, but that if he lost, he was to be killed. Carried by his horses, which were swifter than the north wind, Oinomaus had always overtaken the suitors, as a row of heads before his palace eloquently testified. But Pelops knew all this and bribed Myrtilus, the king's charioteer, to draw the linchpins of his master's car, so that, in the race with Pelops, Oinomaus was thrown, and caught in the reins, was dragged to his death. With Hippodamia, Pelops sailed to his home in Argos, where there were afterward born to them, among other sons, Atreus and Thyestes. For the sins of Tantalos, an inevitable curse of family strife and bloodshed followed all the generations of his house. Unknown to Atreus, his wife yielded herself and her affections to Thyestes. Now, Atreus has promised to sacrifice to Artemis the most beautiful animal that should be found among his flocks. But when one of his ewes gave birth to a golden lamb, he greedily coveted the precious creature, and strangling it, hid its body in a chest that the goddess might not see it. Besides himself, only his wife knew of this lamb, which he seemed to regard as the emblem of the kingship at Mycenae, and she privily gave it to Thyestes, who thereby secured the throne. Prompted by Zeus, Atreus made a pact with his brother that if the sun should be seen to reverse its usual course, the kingship was to revert to himself. One morning the sun chanced to be in total eclipse. Interpreting this as the setting of the sun in the east, Thyestes yielded to Atreus, and then, when all his iniquity was revealed, was expelled from the country. Some time afterward, under the guise of a reconciliation, Atreus recalled him, but actually it was in order to wreak a most revolting revenge, for he killed Thyestes' children and served their cooked flesh to their parent. And in the midst of the meal, with ghoulish satisfaction, made known to the father the nature of the food. Thyestes fled, plotting revenge in his turn, and an oracle declared to him that his desire would be realized through a son whom he should beget by his own daughter. His spirit rebelling at the thought, he endeavored by all possible means to avoid bringing the oracle to fulfillment, even though he should lose his kingdom. Destiny was against him, however, for Aegisthus, a son of unwitting incest, restored him to Mycenae, where he ruled until driven out by Atreus' sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, aided by Tyndareus of Sparta. These two sons married daughters of Tyndareus. The former took Clytemnestra and ruled at Mycenae, and the latter wedded Helen and succeeded his father-in-law on the throne of Sparta. The house of Iacchos. After her removal to the island of Oenon, as we have read in the tales of Corinth, the nymph Aegina bore to Zeus a son named Iacchos. Noticing that he was without companions, his father, turning the ants of the island into human beings, made Iacchos their king. And by a play on the Greek word for ant, these ant-men were known as Myrmidons. By a first marriage, Iacchos had two sons, Peleus and Telamon, and by a second, another son, Phocos. Of all men of that age, Iacchos was the most devoted to the worship of the gods. And so dear was he to them on that account that when a famine came upon Hellas, they removed it in answer to his supplication alone, while after death he was accorded a high place in the kingdom of Hades. Spurred by jealousy, Peleus and Telamon killed their brother Phocos, and for their crime were sent into exile. Telamon took refuge in the island of Salamis, where later he became king and married into the line of Pelops, the fruit of this union being the hero Aias, or Ajax. Afterward, Telamon accompanied Heracles on his expedition against Troy, and as a reward for his services received Hesione, by whom he became the father of Teucros. Peleus made his way to Phthia in Thessaly, and there won the king's daughter and a portion of land. Accidentally killing his father-in-law, he hastened to Iolcos, where Acastos purged him of his pollution, and where too Acastos's wife made the same charge against him that Proitos's wife had alleged against Bellerophon. Acastos believed the tale, as was only too natural, but fearing to take Peleus's life openly resorted to many underhanded plots, although in the end Peleus was saved by the centaur Charon, and from that day these two were fast friends. Becoming enamored of the sea nymph Thetis, the daughter of Nereus, and finding himself baffled by her power to assume any shape she wished, he was counseled by the wise Chiron to seize her and defy her elusiveness. This he did, and though she became now fire, now water, and now beast, he clung to her, until, resuming her normal form, she consented to marriage, and they were wedded on Mount Pelion in the presence of all the gods, who gave them many priceless gifts. In due time a son was born to Peleus and Thetis, and to cleanse him of his inheritance of mortality, his mother would bathe him in ambrosia by day and pass him through fire by night. But Peleus protested at the harshness of the treatment, and Thetis, offended, retired to her home in the sea. Peleus placed the infant in the care of Chiron, who fed him on the flesh and marrow of wild beasts, and gave him the name of Achilles, because his lips had not touched a mother's breast. Training him too in the hunt and in those sports that develop the peculiar strength and beauty of a man. When the boy was 9 years old, Calchas, the prophet, foretold that, if he went with the Greeks against Troy, he should surely die there. And yet, he said, the Hellenes could not conquer the city without him. Through a strange infatuation, Thetis hoped to evade the prophecy and sent Achilles, dressed as a girl, to the court of Lycomedes, king of Scyros, where he remained for 6 years. At the end of this time, Odysseus was deputed by the Greeks to go to Scyros and bring Achilles to Troy. But the young man's disguise safely concealed him for a while. At length, the wily Odysseus had his men blow a loud alarm of trumpets, when out into the main hall of the palace rushed Achilles, who, thinking an enemy was upon them, threw off his feminine garb and donned his armor. Now that his identity was established, he was easily persuaded by Odysseus to espouse the cause of the Greeks, and with his bosom friend Patroclus he joined the host at Aulis. Diomedes and Odysseus. Of all the other heroes who fought about Troy, the most conspicuous are Diomedes and Odysseus, the first of whom was the son of that Tydeus who fell before Thebes. A warrior from his youth, he took part in the capture of Thebes by the Epigonoi, and led to Troy 80 ships from the Argolid and outlying islands. He was valiant in battle, resourceful in plotting, and wise in the counsels of his peers. Frequently associated with him, especially when trickery was to be employed, was Odysseus. This man generally passed as the son of Anticleia, a daughter of Autolycus, and of Laertes, though some gossipy myths will have it that he was in reality the son of Sisyphus, his craftiness and versatility being thus explained as inheritances from both sides of the house. Once during his youth, when on a visit to his grandfather Autolycus near Mount Parnassus, he was wounded on the knees by a boar, and in healing, the wound left a scar, by which he was recognized years afterward by his old nurse. Another time, when Laertes sent him to the mainland to demand restitution from certain Messenians who had carried off some of their sheep from Ithaca, he met Iphitos and received from him the bow which only Odysseus could draw. He won and his bride Penelope, the daughter of Icarius of Lake Diamond. One of his acts, soon after their marriage, foreshadowed the unswerving fidelity of her later years. It is said that when Odysseus refused to make his home in Lake Diamond, Icarius, like a fond parent, persistently besought his daughter to remain behind with her husband, until at last Odysseus, losing patience, bade her choose between himself and her father. Whereupon, without a word, she drew down her veil and followed her husband. In Ithaca she bore him a son Telemachus, but while the child was still in arms, Menelaus came with Palamedes to Odysseus to entreat his aid against Troy. Being averse to war, he feigned madness, but Palamedes saw through the ruse, and taking Telemachus from his mother, made as if to run him through with a sword. At this, Odysseus admitted his pretense, but though he consented to their request, he ever after bore a grudge against Palamedes. The Cypria, traditional causes of the war. There was a time when thousands upon thousands of men cumbered the broad bosom of earth. Having pity on them, Zeus in his great wisdom resolved to lighten earth's burden. So he caused the strife at Ilion to the end that through death he might make a void in the race of men, and the heroes perished, thus bringing to pass the will of Zeus. In these words the late epic known as the Cypria, with an almost modern political casuistry, traces the cause of the war back to overpopulation. Instead of solving the problem by thunderbolt and flood, Zeus decided to use a much less direct method. First of all, he brought about the marriage of Thetis with the mortal Peleus, and then he begat a daughter Helen, who was so beautiful that it could be said of her, "She snareth strong men's eyes, she snareth tall cities, and fire from out her eateth up houses. Such magic had she as a cup of death." In brief, she was a troublemaker by birth. Into the midst of the gods, gathered at the wedding of Peleus, Zeus sent Ares, who stirred up a quarrelsome debate among Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite as to which of them was the most beautiful. And Zeus, knowing that, woman-like, they could never settle this question of themselves, had them appear on Mount Ida before Paris as arbiter. And this Paris judged beneath the trees, 3 crowns of life, 3 diverse goddesses. The gift of Pallas was of war, to lead his east in conquering battles, and make bleed the hearts of Hellas. Hera held a throne, if majesties he craved, to reign alone from Phrygia to the last realm of the west. And Cypris, if he deemed her loveliest, beyond all heaven, made dreams about my face, and for her grace gave me, that is Helen. And lo, her grace was judged the fairest, and she stood above those twain. Paris then awarded Aphrodite the apple inscribed with the legend, "To the most beautiful." At the suggestion of the goddess whom he had honored, Paris built a ship, and with fair omens went to Sparta, where he was courteously entertained. During an absence of Menelaus, however, he threw the laws of hospitality to the winds, made love to Helen, and at last, with the full consent, carried her away in his ship along with her jewels and handmaidens, landing her in Troy after a devious and stormy voyage. When Menelaus demanded her return and was refused, he remembered the oath sworn by his fellow suitors and resolved to invoke their aid in a war of punishment. Wherefore, with his brother Agamemnon of Mycenae, he gathered together the chieftains of the Greeks and set sail from Aulis. They landed first on the coast of Teuthrania, which they attacked under the impression that it was Troy. And here it was that Telephos, the son of Og and Heracles, was sorely wounded by the spear of Achilles. When the Greeks endeavoured to sail thence to their proper destination, they were caught by a storm and driven back to their home coasts. Again Menelaus marshalled them at Aulis, but this time he took the precaution of securing someone to guide them straight to their goal. And such a leader was present in the person of Telephos, who, out of gratitude for having his wound healed by the same spear with which it had been caused, consented to serve the Greeks. At Aulis, Agamemnon killed a sacred hind of Artemis, and the goddess in anger sent on that great host storms and despair of sailing. Whereupon Calchas consulted the omens and made known to Agamemnon that he could not obtain fair winds until his daughter Iphigenia should be sacrificed on the altar of Artemis. Shrinking from the task of taking the maiden from her mother, Agamemnon deputed it to Odysseus, who, shamelessly representing that she was to become the bride of Achilles, led her away from Mycenae. Just as the blood was about to be split on the altar, however, Artemis put a deer in her place to bore her away unseen to the land of the barbarous Tauri, where she became a priestess in her service. Then the seas became calm, and the fleet set sail. On their way the Greeks touched at Tenedos, where Philoctetes, the possessor of the bow of Heracles, received on the foot a serpent's bite, which developed into so loathsome a sore that he had to be removed from Lemnos. At length the army came to the shores of Troy and found their landing disputed by the Trojans. Desirous to acquire the fame of being the first to land, although it meant certain death, Protesilaus, one of the younger heroes, leaped ashore and fell then and there before the spear of Hector. When the tidings of his untimely death reached his young bride Laodamia, she besought the gods that for 3 hours her husband be restored to her. They heard her prayer, but so great was her grief at the hour of his final departure to Hades, that in despair she made an image of him, and finding no comfort in it, took her own life. Unable to assail Troy directly with any chances of success, the Greeks sacked many of the Trojan supply cities and captured much booty. After one of these raids, Achilles received as his prize a maiden, Briseis, and Agamemnon another maiden, Chryseis, a daughter of Chrysis, a priest of Apollo. And it was through the presence of these maidens in the camp that the great wrath of Achilles was kindled with such momentous consequences for the Greeks. The Iliad. The poet of the Kypria gathered up the legends describing the events of the war prior to the action of the Iliad of Homer. The theme of the Iliad, on the contrary, is one episode alone, the wrath of Achilles, though it has been so treated that by skillful allusions it gives glimpses of earlier happenings of the war. And in this way, the recital of the poem is devoid of the monotony that would otherwise result from its failure to touch on raids on the outlying territories of Troy during the 28 days allotted to the action of the epic. Books 1-6. A plague fell upon the Greek host, smiting man and beast so grievously that the pyres of the dead burned continually in multitude. And when Calchas explained this as the visitation of Apollo's anger for the seizure of Chryseis, Agamemnon, with bitter reluctance, restored her to her father, and the plague was stayed. In his thoughtless selfishness, however, Agamemnon took Achilles' braces in her place, whereupon, maddened with anger, Achilles swore that from that day he would withhold his strength and skill from the Greeks, even though many of them should fall by the hand of Hector. And in her sea home, Thetis heard her son's complaint, and won from Zeus the promise that victory would be denied the Greeks until they should do honor to Achilles. Prompted by Zeus in a dream, Agamemnon mustered the army for an assault on Troy. But at the sight of the Trojans' preparations for resistance, he weakened in his purpose, and like a craven suggested to the Greeks that they abandon the war as hopeless. The stubborn Odysseus opposed him, however, and forced him to change his will and to battle with the foe. Long the tide of strife swung uncertainly this way and that, until at length Hector, impatient for a decision and wary of the shameless Helen, proposed that Paris and Menelaus fight a duel, and that to the victor Helen and her wealth be finally surrendered. By an oath and a sacrifice, the opposing leaders ratified their willingness to stand by the outcome of the duel, and Paris and Menelaus then came forth and fought. At one moment, when Menelaus had Paris at his mercy, and the end of the war seemed to be in sight, to the unspeakable despair of the Greeks, Aphrodite veiled Paris in a cloud and hurried him away to safety behind the walls. The gods, taking sides, willed that the strife continue uncertain, and inspired the combatants to mingle deeds of bravery and recklessness. Pandarus, the Trojan, lightly wounded Menelaus, and later the valiant Diomedes as he stormed across the plain. And Diomedes, in his turn, stung to rage by his pain, struck both Aphrodite and Ares until their divine blood flowed from gaping wounds, while Apollo, resentful at the insolence of a mortal, roused the Trojans to still greater resistance. This climax of human ferocity, however, was relieved by scenes of tenderness and affection more characteristic of peace than of war, for when Glaucus and Diomedes were about to join in combat, they discovered that their fathers had been associated in friendship years before. Forthwith they exchanged armor and vowed to avoid one another thenceforth in the field of battle. And though Glaucus gave gold armor for bronze, for friendship's sake he kept hidden within his heart any regret he might have felt. Hector, returning to the battle, took a brave soldier's farewell of his wife Andromache and of his child Astyanax in words that none can ever forget. Dear one, I pray thee be not of over-sorrowful heart. No man against my fate shall hurl me to Hades. Only destiny, I ween, no man hath escaped, be he coward or be he valiant, when once he hath been born. Books 7 to 12. Even the gods grew weary of this fruitless melee, and seeking to end it, they caused Hector and Aias to fight in single combat, until a truce was established for the two armies. During the armistice, the Trojans urged Paris to give Helen up, but he would consent only to a compromise, the surrender of her wealth with the addition of some of his own. An offer to this effect the Greeks scornfully rejected, and prepared to carry the war to the bitter end, so that on the next day the battle began afresh, and so threatening were the assaults of the Trojans that Agamemnon, fearful of his cause, sent an embassy to Achilles, bearing a confession of wrong and promises of amends. But neither confessions nor promises moved the wrathful man, who even hardened his heart the more. The hopes of the Greeks fell, only to be revived that night by a successful raid of Diomedes and Odysseus within the Trojan lines. On the morrow, however, fortune went once more against them, for Agamemnon, Diomedes, and Odysseus were all wounded, and the Greeks without their aid were forced to retreat to the line of their ships. Books 13 to 18. When Agamemnon was on the point of ordering his followers to launch the ships and withdraw home, Poseidon came to his help and breathed strength and valor into the hearts of Aias, the son of Telamon, and Aias, the son of Oileus. At the head of the Greeks, these two wounded Hector and routed his fellow warriors. But their glory was brief, for Hector was revived by Apollo and led his men in a counter-attack, which brought them once more to the ships. Thereupon, Patroclus tried to persuade Achilles to forego his anger and rally the Greeks, and failing in this, he borrowed Achilles' armor and impetuously rushed into the battle himself, scattering the foe before him until he fell a victim to the weapons of Hector and the gale of Apollo. Hector despoiled him of his famous armor, but the Greeks, after a long struggle, obtained possession of his body. Achilles' grief kindled within him a hatred of the Trojans great enough to quench his wrath at Agamemnon, and unburdening his heart to Thetis, she brought him a marvelous set of armor newly made for him in the forges of Hephaestus, at the sight of which the spirit of vengeance came upon him. Books 19 to 24. The next morning, Achilles appeared before the Greeks, saying, I will now stay my anger. It beseems me not ever implacably to be wroth, but come rouse speedily to the fight the flowing-haired Achaeans, that I may go forth against the men of Troy and put them again to the proof. With these words he sallied out to battle, slaying many of the Trojan heroes, and pursuing many others into the waters of the river Scamandros, which, when it turned on him, he quelled with the fires of Hephaestus. The Trojan cause seemed lost, and to save it, Hector, despite Priam's entreaties, stepped forth from the city gates face to face with the victorious Achilles. Struck suddenly with fear, however, the Trojan hero turned and fled, while Achilles pursued him once, twice, and thrice round the walls, and then brought him to the ground, dead, after which he mutilated the body, and binding it to his chariot, dragged it in the dust, while Priam and Andromache looked down from the walls of Troy. On his return to the camp, he duly burned the body of Patroclus and held funeral games, and moved by the tender appeal of Thetis, he yielded the body of Hector to Priam, besides allowing the Trojans a truce of 12 days, in which to perform the burial rites of their noble defender. The Aethiopes, the death of Achilles. Arctinos of Miletus, the oldest Greek epic poet definitely known, wrote the Aethiopes as a chronicle of the events of the war from the death of Hector to the death of Achilles. Achilles himself, broadly treated, and not one of his moods, was the theme of the poem, and consequently the scenes were rather mechanically strung together without essential unity. At the beginning of the epic, the Amazon Penthesilea was represented as coming to the support of the Trojans. Achilles battled with her as though she had been a man, and killed her. But the sight of her beauty as she lay fallen before him awakened his remorse. Thersites observed it, and mocked him for his weakness. But with a thrust of his sword Achilles smote him dead, while the Greeks, divided among themselves as to the justice of the deed, became involved in a dissension that was not healed until Achilles was ritually washed of his sin in Lesbos. Another ally now joined the defenders of Troy, Memnon, a nephew of Priam and the son of Eos and Tithonus, who came from Ethiopia. Like Achilles, he wore armor curiously fashioned by Hephaestus, but he was inferior to the Greek in head and hand and fell before him. Although, at the supplication of Eos, Zeus granted him immortality. Achilles, just as he was about to follow up his victory with the root of the foe, was slain by an arrow guided by Apollo from the bow of Paris. But in the melee which ensued, Aias, the son of Telamon, carried the body away to the Greek ships, and over it Thetis, her sister nymphs, and the Muses made piteous lamentation. When at last it lay burning on the pyre, Thetis, unseen, snatched it from the flames and bore it away to the white isle in the friendless waters of the Euxine Sea, where Achilles was restored to life and lived with Helen as his wife, although some said that the Greeks mingled his ashes with those of his friend Patroclus, and that after death he consorted with Medea in the islands of the blessed. The Little Iliad and the Ilio-Persis, the fall of Troy. In the Little Iliad, Lesches of Lesbos recounted the events of the siege from the death of Achilles to the entrance of the wooden horse into Troy, these events being so set forth as to centre about the person of Odysseus. As its name implies, the Ilio-Persis, or sack of Ilion, of Archintos, deals with the overthrow of the city. Aias, the son of Telamon, demanded that as a kinsman of Achilles he should be given the dead warrior's arms. But since Odysseus made a counterclaim, the sons of Atreus instituted a contest to decide the future ownership of the weapons. With the help of Athene, Odius won them, and so sore a wound was this to the pride of Aias that he became a raving madman and slew himself. By means of an ambuscade, Odysseus captured Helenos, a son of Priam, who was gifted with prophecy, and obliged him to forecast the outcome of the war. When his answer was that Troy would fall before the bow of Heracles, Diomedes went to Lemnos, and by blandishments and wiles brought back with him Philoctetes, who had the bow, and after Philoctetes' wound had been healed by Machaon, he strode out to the battle. With an arrow from the great bow, Paris fell mortally wounded. Only Oinon, his former wife, was in a position to aid him, but she took advantage of this opportunity for revenge and let him die. And after Menelaus had spitefully abused the body, the Trojans gave it burial. Neoptolemus, or Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, was now brought from his home in Scyros to buttress the Greek cause, and through his valour the enemy were sealed within their walls. Craftily, Odysseus made his way within the city, and after slaying several Trojans, returned safely with the sacred Palladion, on which the Trojans' fortunes hung. Now Epeios, instructed by Athene, had made a huge hollow horse of wood, in which were hidden 50 of the most valiant of the Greek warriors, while the rest were ordered to withdraw to Tenedos, leaving the horse before the gates of Troy. When they were gone, the citizens, thinking that their troubles were ended, emerged from their gates and gathered about the horse, but were much puzzled by the inscription which it bore: a thank offering from the Hellenes to Athene for their home return. Was this true, or was it only a ruse? Those who believed it to be a trick spoke for destroying the horse. Laocoon, a priest, thrust a spear into its side, and at the hollow sound given back, pronounced it Greek guile. But shortly afterward, 2 serpents came out of the sea and crushed him and his 2 sons to death. Helen walked about the horse, imitating the voices of the Greek leaders' wives, and Anticlus, one of the men within it, would have answered had not Odysseus stopped his mouth. Nevertheless, those who accepted the inscription as innocent prevailed, and the horse was drawn into the city through a breach in the walls, after which the citizens gave themselves over to revelry until they were overcome by the heavy sleep of exhaustion. Creeping out from their lair, and led by Sinon, a Trojan traitor, the Greeks now took the citadel by surprise, and afterward proceeded to ravage the city, butchering the sleeping populace like helpless cattle. In their fury, they disregarded all the restraints of religion. Neoptolemus slew Priam, though a suppliant at the altar of Zeus. Aias, the son of Oileus, dragged Cassandra from the altar of Athene. Odysseus threw Hector's son, Astyanax, from the walls, for fear this babe some day might raise again his fallen land. Together the Greeks set fire to the city, and in the sight of its flame and smoke sacrificed Polyxena, Priam's youngest daughter, at the tomb of Achilles. Neoptolemus carried off Andromache and Odysseus Hecabe as prizes of war. Menelaus slew Helen's new husband, Deiphobos, and conveyed Helen herself to his ships. Now that the object of the war was attained, the Greeks with the utmost joy prepared to sail away to their distant homes. But alas! They had not counted on the wrath of Athene, who, roused by the offence of the son of Oileus at her shrine, almost implacably condemned them to an homecoming that striveth evermore and cometh to no home. The Nostoi. In addition to Homer's Odyssey, which describes the devious return of Odysseus, there were 5 epic books of returns written by Aegeus of Troezen, and dealing with the wanderings of the other heroes, especially those of the 2 sons of Atreus. These books are now lost, our knowledge of their contents being derived from a single brief summary, from a few casual references, and from some of the dramas of the 5th century. Menelaus and Helen. Naturally, one's first interest is to learn the fate of Menelaus and Helen. As the fleet was about to depart for Hellas, Athene provoked a quarrel between the son of Atreus, and to appease the goddess Agamemnon remained at Troy for a space, while Menelaus sailed away with his newly recovered wife, the first point of Greek soil on which they set foot being Sonion, the extremity of the Attic peninsula. After a delay caused by the death of the pilot, they set forth again. But ere they could round the point of the Peloponnesus, the vessels were scattered by a storm. With only 5 sail left, Menelaus made the island of Crete, whence, vainly attempting to steer homeward, he was driven to Cyprus, Phoenicia, Ethiopia, Libya, and last of all, Egypt. Again headwinds long detained him, but these ceased when, heeding the advice of Proteus, he sacrificed to the gods of the Nile, after which he and Helen were carried swiftly to Sparta, where they lived together for many years, until, the time coming at last for them to end this life, they were given immortality in the islands of the blessed, by virtue of their divine descent. Many centuries later, the tomb which held the body of Helen was shown to visitors in Sparta as one of the important sights of the city. Agamemnon. While Agamemnon was pressing toward Hellas with Cassandra, the shade of Achilles appeared to him, and warning him of an unhappy homecoming, endeavoured to turn him aside from his course. During his absence, Aegisthus, by reason of the old family feud, had fomented trouble in his kingdom, and had induced Clytemnestra, who was very unlike the faithful Penelope, to live with him in adultery. On Agamemnon's return to Mycenae, or to Argos, Aegisthus, with the connivance of Clytemnestra, killed Cassandra, and then, inviting Agamemnon to a feast, treacherously murdered him too, although in another form of the narrative, it was Agamemnon who fell first, slain in the bath by the hand of his wife, ostensibly to punish him for the sacrifice of Iphigenia 10 years before. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra now reigned as king and queen. A sure, though slow, vengeance was advancing upon the wrongdoers. Orestes, the youngest son of the murdered king, was secretly conveyed by his sister Electra to the home of Strophios, a friend, who brought him up with his own son Pylades, and through long years of companionship, the 2 boys became devoted friends, whom nothing but death could part. Knowing his mother's unspeakable crime, Orestes harboured revenge in his heart, and urged on by the Delphic oracle, he went to Mycenae, where, by representing himself as a stranger bearing tidings of the death of Orestes, he was accorded the hospitality of the palace. Later, Pylades, carrying an urn which he alleged to contain the bones of Orestes, was also received, and having thus insinuated themselves into the privacy of the royal home, at a favourable opportunity they killed both Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. From the moment in which Orestes stained his hand in his mother's blood, he was hunted by shapes of pain, and through Hellas was lashed like a burning wheel, for the avenging furies of his mother were upon him. Pursued by them to Athens, he was tried on Areopagus and acquitted, after which, appealing to the oracle, he was told that to remove his blood guiltiness he must first carry away from the land of the Tauroi the sacred image of Artemis which had fallen from heaven. Going thither with Pylades, he found that the priestess of the goddess was his own sister Iphigenia, and after succeeding, by means of a cunning plot, in evading the watchful Taurians, he sailed away with the image and his sister, some say, to Rhodes, where he was at last given rest from the Furies. The other heroes, except Odysseus. On leaving Troy, Neoptolemus went across Thrace and conquered the country of the Molossians, but later he seized Hermione, the wife of Orestes, and for this act was killed by her husband at Delphi. The lesser Aias, for his impiety against Athene, was cast up on the coast of Euboea, and would have been saved had he not boasted of his ability to rescue himself without the aid of the gods. After escaping many dangers, Diomedes reached his home in Argos, but, finding that his wife was living in adultery, he immediately departed for Aetolia. When making an attempt, some time afterward, to return to his home, he was shipwrecked on the shores of Italy, and being saved, lived there until his death. Demophon, the son of Theseus, on his way back to Athens, visited the Bisaltian Thracians and married Phyllis, a princess of the land. When he expressed to his wife a wish to return to his native country, she gave him a chest which he was not to open until he should despair of seeing her again. But once out of her sight, he sailed to Cyprus instead of Athens, and there took up his permanent abode. Phyllis at last, utterly weary of waiting longer, invoked a curse on him, and killed herself. At about the same time, Demophon opened the chest, but something he saw within it inspired him with fear, and hastily mounting to ride away, he was thrown on the point of his sword by the fall of his horse, and instantly killed. The Odyssey. In order to recount the adventures of the homeward journey of Odysseus in their proper sequence, one must begin with the hero's own narrative in the middle of the Odyssey, and later return to the first and succeeding parts. Books 9 to 12. A fair wind bore Odysseus from Ilion to Ismaros, which he sacked, and then held his course for Cape Malea, although, before he could round it, Zeus swept him southward, past Cythera, to the land of the lotus eaters, where men ate of the spicy bloom of the lotus and became forever oblivious of their old home. Apprehensive lest his companions too be minded, in the hollow lotus land to live and lie reclined, on the hills like gods together, careless of mankind. Odysseus led them to the ships against their will, and sailed to the country of the Cyclopes, a race of giants, each with a single eye in the middle of his forehead. One of them, Polyphemus by name, entrapped Odysseus in his cave, but the cunning man of Ithaca put out his eye and escaped with a remnant of his men. He now made for the island of Aiolos, the master of the winds. And as he set sail, thence upon a sojourn of many days, his host gave him a bag, in which were enclosed all the winds except that one which would speed him on his way to Ithaca. His companions, however, suspecting that some treasures were concealed in the bag, opened it while their leader slept, and the winds, rushing forth, beat the vessel back to the island which they had just left. But where Iolaus refused them further hospitality and sent them away from his coasts. They came next to the land of the cruel Laestrygonians, who destroyed all of their ships but one, on which they had the good fortune to reach the island of the sorceress goddess Circe, a daughter of Helios. By means of a charm, she changed Odysseus's men into swine, but the hero himself she took as a lover into her home. Nevertheless, the call of home was upon him, and he could endure the sweet bondage for no longer than a year, so that, at length, he persuaded Circe to aid him in an attempt to return to Ithaca. As a first step, she counselled him to make the descent to Hades, where he saw the shades of his mother and of many of the heroes, and learned from Tiresias, the Theban seer, the route which he should pursue to reach his home. Launching his ship once more, he sailed safely past the Sirens, having his men bind him tightly to the mast, and himself stopping their ears with wax. On he pressed through the crashing rocks, and past Scylla and Charybdis, to the island of Thrinacia, where further disaster befell him, for his men, unable to be restrained, slew some of the sacred cattle of the sun, and caused a storm to break upon their ship, so that all were lost save Odysseus himself. During 10 days he was tossed about on a raft, and then left by the waves on the shore of the island of the goddess Calypso, with whom he lived for the space of 8 years. Books 1 to 8. At the end of this time, Zeus hearkened to the request of Athene and gave permission for Odysseus to be restored to his native soil. In the meantime, Athene, in the guise of Mentor, had visited Telemachus, Odysseus' son, in Ithaca, and had bidden him send his mother's many wooers to their homes and to go in search of his father. But the suitors would not listen to the youth's words, even though they were accompanied by a prophetic warning of a dreadful doom that awaited them should they persist in their course. Unknown to them, Telemachus went to Nestor in Pylos, and thence to the court of Menelaus and Helen in Sparta. And although the only tidings which he could glean of his father were vague and far from recent, nevertheless, they encouraged him to hope. Through Hermes, Zeus commanded Calypso to release Odysseus. Reluctantly she helped him build a raft, and after 12 days of labor on it, saw him depart from her island. 20 days later he was washed up on the shore of Scheria, the island country of the Phaeacians, whose king was Alcinous. The princess Nausicaa chanced to find him in his distress, and led him to the palace, where he told the long story of his still longer wanderings, and received from the king the promise of a safe convoy to Ithaca. Books 13 to 25. The next day a magic ship of the Phaeacians bore Odysseus away, and left him on the shore of his homeland in a deep sleep. But when he awoke, he was unable to recognize the place until Athene cleared his bewildered vision. Disguising himself as a beggar in obedience to her word, he made his way to the hut of the swineherd Eumaeus, who had remained loyal to his long-absent master, and without revealing his identity, he learned from his old servant many things concerning the suitors. Just at this time Telemachus chanced to return from Sparta, safely eluding an ambuscade prepared for him by his enemies, and on landing he went to the hut of Eumaeus and sent the swineherd to the palace with a message for his mother. In the interval, he and Odysseus were left alone together, and at this supreme moment, Athene brought about a recognition of father and son, who jointly plotted the destruction of the importunate wooers. On the following day, Odysseus entered the palace. Though still disguised, he was recognized by his old dog Argos, which died of sheer delight. Yet of all the people in the palace, including even Penelope, only Eurycleia, his nurse, knew him. As it happened, it was on that very day that Penelope announced to her suitors that when the next sun had risen, she would definitely settle the question which had brought them all to Ithaca. During all the months of their wooing, she had put them off with the promise that as soon as she should complete a fabric, then on her loom she would make her selection from among them. But the day of the choice never came, for each night, it was said, she unravelled what she had woven the day before. At last, however, she now declared that she would accept the man who with Odysseus's bow could send an arrow through the holes of 12 axe blades arranged in a row. But when the trial of strength and skill came, not one of the suitors was able even to bend the bow. Though much derided, Odysseus then stepped forward, and to the consternation of all, sent the arrow through the appointed mark, after which, turning quickly on the suitors, he shot them one by one. Yet so changed was he through the many hardships which he had suffered, as well as through the mere lapse of years, that it was long before Penelope could believe he was really her own Odysseus. At length convinced, she welcomed him back to the home and to the place which she had kept sacred for him in her affection. And thenceforward they lived together at Ithaca, as they had lived before, happy in their mutual love, and save for an unsuccessful attack of the dead suitor's friends at peace with all mankind. The Telegonia. The later adventures of Odysseus and his sons are detailed in the 6th century epic, the Telegonia, the work of Eugamon of Cyrene, which completed the Trojan cycle of myths. After the burial of the suitors by their kinsmen, Odysseus sailed across to Elis to inspect his herds. Returning to Ithaca for a brief time only, he went to the land of the Thesprotians and wedded their queen Callidice, for, some allege, he had dismissed Penelope on account of her wavering affections. On the death of Callidice, their son took the crown of Thesprotia, and Odysseus went back to Ithaca about the same time that Telegonos, the son whom Circe had borne to him, set out to find his father. Chancing to land on Ithaca, he proceeded to plunder the country, and, defying a band of Ithacans whom Odysseus led against him, he killed his father in the conflict, in utter ignorance of what he was doing. But when the import of his act was made known to him, accompanied by Penelope and Telemachus, he bore the body of Odysseus back to Circe.